interesting to see how the standard season starts. Reid Duke has taken a contender from last season, which is the Green Devotion decks. It's one of the Nykthos decks that kept most of its cards intact, and he has just updated it today for this tournament. He has added, it looks like, Sarkhan the Dragon Master to his deck, as well as solidifying his mana base.
Well, one of the things that was going on with his list, then when we saw Reid play this in the Invitational, was he had already cut Burning Tree Emissary and went to a more conventional ramp into big creature deck with Nykthos as sort of a subset of that plan. That deck is fairly intact, as you mentioned, through the rotation, and the main deck not showing off any new cards, with the exception of the Sarkhans that you mentioned, 1 or 2 cards in the sideboard, but this is very similar to the list that Reid just got to play in the Invitational not that long ago.
Yeah, the cards the deck lost would have been Garruk, Caller of Beasts up at the top of the curve. He no longer has that, but he has another Planeswalker that he can play here. You see 2 Sarkhan in his deck. His opponent is going to be Dylan Fay, and Dylan is trying something new. This is not black-white mid-range. This is straight black-white control. And if you watched Block a lot, this won't surprise you too much. It's a 4 Elspeth deck with a pile of removal.
And Elspeth, the only way to win in the list, there's 4 copies of Read the Bones, and really the rest of this, besides 1 copy of Empty the Pits, is removal or discard. You see Dylan leading off with the Thoughtseize here.
Yeah, so Dylan was set up by Thoughtseizing, seeing what's going on. He does see that Reid kept a 2-lander of just Mountain, Forest, and to go with that, he had 2 mana accelerants, a Caryatid and a Voyaging Satyr, 2 Genesis Hydra, and 1 copy of Sarkhan the Dragon Master.
And if Dylan is taking the Caryatid there, I believe that means he probably has a removal spell for the Voyaging Satyr, and he's just trying to choke Reid's mana. It's a really effective way to attack devotion strategies.
Yeah, you saw Reid with just 2 lands. He has 4 lands if you count the mana creatures. If Dylan can keep Reid's mana down, then his cards like Genesis Hydra and Sarkhan don't seem as threatening here. And we're going to see a Scoured Barrens for Dylan. This is part of the new common land cycle from Khans of Tarkir. They come into play tapped and gain you a life. He is playing these in addition to the 4 temples.
I think you're going to see a lot of these lands in control and mid-range strategies. In fact, Reid has them in his Devotion Shell here as well.
Yeah, gets in an attack for 1 there, putting Dylan to 17 and just passing back.
It's an interesting element of Dylan's deck here. 4 copies of the Scoured Barrens, as you mentioned, and 4 copies of Radiant Fountain, which I think you're going to see a lot of in 1 and 2 color mid-range and control decks.
Yeah, that's something we really haven't seen yet. This is just a colorless land that gains you 2 life. On Dylan's side, he's going to go for 3 mana to Banishing Light the Voyaging Satyr. And looking at Dylan's deck, there's a lot of this just generic removal in the deck.
All he's trying to do is buy time to get to Elspeth. There's a ton of removal, a fair amount of discard to help get him there.
Yeah, Reid's play is Nylea, God of the Hunt. And he's gone for some card advantage. If you look at his deck list choices, he has 3 Silence the Believers. This is a card that saw some play at Block, but really hadn't seen play in the mono-black removal decks up until this point.
If your expectations for week 1 is that there's going to be a variety of 3-color mid-range decks glued together by Corsair Crewfix, Silence the Believers could be an excellent choice. Not the best suited removal spell for the very aggressive matchups, but if you think the games are going to go fairly long and involve a lot of creatures going into play, could be a superstar.
Dylan Thoughtseized Reid again. He saw the 2 Genesis Hydra, left both of them in Reid's hand and took that Sarkhan. Reid cast Elvish Mystic, but both players know that there just are 2 Hydras in Reid's hand. The Hydra, though, I would imagine is pretty well suited to play a removal spell game.
The games are, again, they're going to go on for a pretty long time, and it's a 2-for-1, and with Nylea in play, that could be a huge swing as well. If Reid can get this Nylea regularly threatening Devotion, that puts a lot of pressure on Dylan to react to everything that Reid casts.
Yeah, Silence the Believers took care of the Elvish Mystic. Reid then plays the Voyaging Satyr. It looks like his creature might survive. Dylan's going to play Read the Bones. And that means if Reid gets to untap with this Voyaging Satyr, 5 to me seems like the number when you start casting Genesis Hydra.
Well, he has an incentive to cast his Genesis Hydras in the spot anyway because he needs to start doing something with that Nylea. On top of that, 3 is where Corsair of Crewfix becomes a card you can hit, and that's pretty attractive.
Yeah, Dylan does not, he looks like he's going to keep one of the 2 cards. Neither of them were lands. He does have an Elspeth in his hand, so he has something to build up to there. And one of the cards that he's kept is End Hostilities. This is 5-mana spell from Khans. This is our new sweepers. We don't have a 4-mana sweeper in white anymore.
The source of some controversy, is this good enough to play? Dylan believes it is. 3 copies in his main deck.
Yeah, the upside is you get to destroy all permanents attached to creatures, which at first may not seem like much. You think there aren't many equipment that are played, but in decks that bestow, which mono black aggro and the like do, it does kill all the bestowed enchantments as well.
So I like this play a lot from Reid. Instead of firing off this Genesis Hydra, he's just attacking and pumping. He needs to extract as much value as possible, given, you know, what Dylan's deck appears to be, which is really removal heavy. If he misses with the Genesis Hydra, it's probably going to be a challenge for him to win, especially post Reid the Bones. So I like the way that Reid's trying to squeeze as much value as possible out of his cards.
Dylan did not hit land 6 for Elspeth there. He did play Liliana Vess. Had a pretty good turn there with her. He got to plus her, but Reid had a second copy of Nylea in his hand, so didn't get a real card there. Reid now hits a 6th land, and this is where Genesis Hydra starts getting really good. He gets the top 4 cards, and he gets a Chandra Pyromaster off it.
And that might have been the payoff there for Reid for trying to wait one more turn. 4 is the flashpoint where he can hit some of his Planeswalkers, like Xenagos or Chandra that you see on the table now. And those cards are potentially very valuable in allowing him to slog through all the removal that Dylan's bringing to the table.
Yeah. Now, because it's a red card and not a green card, there's only 4 devotion on the table for Nylea. There was a chance there that Reid was going to cascade, if you will. He was going to Genesis Hydra into if he Genesis Hydra into a green card, Dylan would be taking 6 here. That said, I still would be pretty happy to have a Chandra against this kind of control deck.
Yeah, I believe Reid would have preferred to get that Liliana off the table this turn. That would have been really nice, but I think he'll settle for a Chandra.
Yeah, Chandra goes up, put to 5. That will put Dylan down to 10 life. Dylan's going to need probably to end these hostilities quickly. He does have a 6th land, it was Caves of Koilos, so now he has a choice between Elspeth and Hostilities, and what I can only imagine are a lot more removal spells.
Because Nylea gives everything else that Reid has trample, I think that Elspeth is a poor play this turn. If he pumps it, Reid can just play over the top. If he minuses, the Voyaging Satyr can finish off the Elspeth. So I think Dylan should be casting End Hostilities, or if he can chain together multiple removal spells that contains Reid's board, that's fine too. But I think this is a pretty good spot for End Hostilities.
It's worth noting that Reid's 5th land was a Nykthos, Shrine to Nyx, so on top of having what you know, he does have 4 green devotion at the moment, so he can make extra mana. If he has the potential to get 2 pumps off this Nylea.
Yeah. So it depends exactly what the nature of Dylan's hand is. If he had, you know, let's say multiple copies of Banishing Light where he could just take care of the Planeswalkers, I think that would be one thing.
It looks like he may have 3 copies of Elspeth.
Yeah, so I think this is kind of where he's got to start off.
Yeah, hostilities are ended. Liliana will get Reid to discard that second Genesis Hydra. She goes up to 7.
Well,
I have jokes before about Liliana saying that I don't think she has a 3rd ability, because I don't ever feel like people bring her to 8 and ultimate her. But we're getting close to actually seeing that happen.
For sure, and I mean, Reid's graveyard is not that excellent for a Liliana ultimate here, but it does tax, if nothing else, it's just taxing Reid's hand the whole time. He didn't play what he just drew, so Dylan can just keep plussing until Reid presents enough. If Dylan keeps playing removal spells, then it's very likely the game gets to the spot where Liliana's ultimate is game-winning.
Second Planeswalker here. That's Elspeth Sun's champion. Yeah, as you mentioned, Reid zeroed his Chandra, found a Voyaging Satyr, cast it, but did hang on to a card. Now, there are no instants in Reid's deck, so Liliana will get the card if Dylan chooses to plus it.
I'm trying to see what the card could have been in Reid's hand that he elected not to cast, or could not cast. Because at 5 mana, it appears his entire deck is online and good to go.
Yeah, I was going to say it could have been an extra copy of Nylea, but that's already happened. Dylan will play Elspeth and plus it, though. Hasn't used the Liliana yet. And he's going to use the -2 on it. And that, to me, has always been the conundrum with Liliana, is that when I say I never see it -8'd, is whenever I've played with the card, it's been, I could build it up to 8, but -2ing it a couple times, you know, usually wins the game anyways.
That's the thing. Liliana appears in control decks in any matchup where the ultimate is game winning. normally minusing a few times and getting more removal spells or whatever your quality threat is also good enough to win the game and comes with considerably less risk. So not surprising to see this play pattern manifest against Reid as well, especially because his graveyard really isn't that juicy for a Liliana Ultimate. There's a lot of creatures there, but it's not really amounting to much for Dylan.
Okay. And yeah, and it looks like he may just try to get more regular removal spells, just something like Banishing Light to deal with the Nylea, which is a card that Dylan can't get right now. Interestingly enough, and this is something I just want to mention on deck building sides, I've talked about this before, Dylan's deck is not playing any copies of Utter End, and that's a new card. It's 2 black-white that exiles a non-land permanent. It's a card that I would have thought we would have seen in this style of deck, this black-white kill everything, play a Planeswalker.
Especially, as you mentioned, it's a black-white mid-range deck. It has a boatload of removal to start with. Planeswalkers and Gods can be problematic for this kind of strategy, and Utter End cleans that up very nicely. So I agree. It is 4 mana, and there's a lot of expensive things in this deck, so something's got to give at some point. But that could easily be the Silence of the Believers, for example, that we saw earlier.
All right, Courser of Krufix for Reid Duke here. That was from his hand. He's going to 0 with Chandra to find Sylvan Caryatid. No, sorry. The Courser's got, that's revealed to Caryatid. The Chandra got the Courser for him. Some tricks there. He set up his Chandra with a Temple. But he's not able to deal damage right now. He has Devotion of 4, and that's probably a little concern to Dylan. He will plus the Liliana that gets Reid's last card, which was another copy of Chandra. So there you go. There's the card he can't cast.
It's really the only other card in the deck that he could have in his hand that would not make sense to cast.
Banishing Light from Dylan takes out the Chandra. So now Nylea could be active next turn.
It's interesting because Dylan has such a commanding presence on the board, but there just might be a little too much going on Reid's side. You know, the Planeswalkers are creating some issues for Dylan, and then Nylea is making it so Elspeth isn't just a lock on the ground.
Yeah, he's going to read the bones down to 8. I was expecting him to Banishing Light the Nylea there.
It seems like the more threatening card at this point. And Dylan's taking so much damage here. He's at 8. You know, he's read the bones and Thoughtseize multiple times. He's taken some chip shots, so
right.
He might not even be able to block out of this turn if Reid's able to generate more mana with a Nykthos or something along those lines.
Now we should remember Nylea does not give herself trample.
Correct. It's only other
creatures. So that, you know, if you looked at this board and didn't know that, you'd have to be pretty concerned for Dylan. Reid will draw Caryatid. Wooded Foothills off the top is played. That's the first interaction we've seen of Courser plus fetch lands, but I have to imagine it's not the last one. This seems like one of the more powerful additions to these decks.
Courser Krufix was the superstar of block and standard, and fetch lands are also incredibly powerful, and the two work exceedingly well together. So get used to seeing a lot of this.
As you see, first of all, to go over it, it's a land, so you can play it off Courser. Second, when you crack it, you actually will gain a life off Courser, so you negates the -1 ability. And third, when you're looking at the top card of your deck, having a shuffle whenever you want it is really a valuable thing.
Yeah, it's a lot of small synergies that are very good, and the opportunity cost is very low. So get used to this.
All right, a swing with Reid from Courser and Nylea. You have to think, Dylan's going to put 1 in front of Nylea, 4 in front of Courser. Reid has the ability to actually make a lot of mana here, so he's going to Nykthos up to 5, then he untaps with Voyaging Satyr, and then he can go ahead and Nykthos that up to 8. And that will be 2 pumps on Courser, so 6 trampling power will trample 2 over to Dylan.
And Reid making no effort to go after the Planeswalkers to this point, which makes a lot of sense to me. He can't really get to them, and Dylan's life total is fairly low. So I like Reid trying to apply as much pressure to Dylan as possible in this spot.
Yep. Silence the Believers and Banishing Light, both in Dylan's hand. And he's going to silence the Believers, and he's going to strive it.
So this is a spot where it is quite a bit better than Utter End. And
yeah.
Again, I anticipate we're going to be seeing a lot of these sort of cards, these 4 or 5 mana removal spells, maybe generate a little bit of extra value. Things that are well suited to fight mid-range battles have a potential, I think, to become much better in the new format.
And this is interesting because when you have a 1-for-1 control deck like Black-White Control, Remember, you don't have those cards like Pack Rat or like Desecration Demon to close out a game early. You have to go late, and Silence the Believers is one of the few cards that can get you that real 2-for-1.
Yeah, and Reid's just tapping to this. He knows that Elspeth's about to take over this game, and time is something of an issue in these matchups where your opponent's playing a ton of removal, so Reid would rather just cut his losses and go on to the next one.
Game 1 over to Dylan Fay. Reid has got to have been prepared for a Thoughtseize Heroes downfall deck. If I were to say things that, my checklist of things I expect my opponents to do, it's pretty high on it. What does he have on the board for this matchup?
So Reid's sideboard is 4 Magma Spray, 4 Nylea's Disciple, anticipating a lot of aggressive decks week 1, which makes a lot of sense. 2 Setessan Tactics, 2 Nissa Worldwaker, a Reclamation Sage, a Hornet Queen, and a Crater's Claw. So I think the 2 Nissa Worldwakers, they make a lot of sense in this matchup. Dylan showed some struggle with Planeswalkers in a general sense, and even if he had a lot of answers, I still think it's fine to bring in, just try to tax and overwhelm Dylan's removal spells. The rest of this, I don't think these cards are particularly well suited. Maybe the Hornet's Queen, maybe the Crater's Claw, but these are sort of marginal additions.
Hornet Queen was pretty good against mono black Devotion because it's pretty hard to 1-for-1 kill spell it. There are end hostilities in this black-white control deck. We now have a sweeper that's not blue-white, it's just white, so this deck has access to a true sweeper. I wouldn't be surprised to see Hornet Queen. Reclamation Sage you were mentioning because of the Banishing Lights.
And this is the type of deck where Suspension Field could hypothetically be in as well. So I think Reclamation Sage is a pretty safe card to bring in.
Suspension Field is a uncommon journey to nowhere. It's basically an Oblivion Ring for creatures with toughness 3 or greater, and it's at 2 mana. It is not in Dylan's deck, but you're absolutely right that it's something that you could think you'd see here.
Dylan is playing 4 copies of Last Breath, which is probably a better week 1 call because the 2 cards, if you've talked to anyone who's playing Standard, either in this tournament or just getting ready for the season, the 2 cards that appear to be on everyone's mind right now are Courser Crucifix and Goblin Rabble Master. And you want to kill those as quickly and efficiently as possible. So even though Suspension Field is a little bit more flexible in what it can target, I can totally understand Last Breath being the best week 1 card.
Going to Dylan's sideboard, he does have access, I think, he has the 4th Thoughtseize in his board. I would imagine he will board that in here. Thoughtseize has been a great way to attack mono green Devotion. Outside of that, there's not too many things I like here. Maybe a Faded Retribution. He has one of those on the board. This seems like a matchup where I want to sweep the board early and often, and I might actually have time to get to the 7 mana to cast this.
Yeah, Dylan has cards like Nyx Fleece Ram, but Reid's deck's not really beat down deck. He has Bramaz, but it's pretty easy for Reid to overpower Bramaz if he gets enough time to set up his shop. More sweepers seem really excellent for this matchup. Drowned Sorrow is likely too narrow. Reid's, only got the couple mana creatures. There's going to be spots where it's incredible, but I think it's a risky card to bring in. The Faded Retribution seems pretty safe here.
It's not a Burning Tree Emissary deck anymore, right? That's kind of... We only actually have 8 creatures you can kill with Drowned Sorrow. Maybe more if you count Satyr tokens off Xenagos, but on the control side, I'm not really excited to sweep those.
Right.
Overall, though, I feel like a black-white control deck is a great way to attack this Devotion strategy, and I wouldn't be surprised to see Dylan get the 2nd game as well.
He does have a lot of the right tools. The fact that his deck is not flush with answers for Planeswalkers is a concern. But Stride of the Believers comes with its own, Silence the Believers, rather, comes with its own upside as well, as we saw in game number 1.
Turn 1 Elvish Mystic from Reid will get met with a Thoughtseize from Dylan, and couldn't be too soon. Reid does have a turn 2 Courser Crucifix possible, which Dylan will take. That leaves Reid with a pair of lands, a Reclamation Sage, and Xenagos the Reveler, but there is no red mana in Reid's hand yet, so Xenagos isn't a threat yet.
And Reid's deck is pretty red mana intensive. I mean, he's playing Sarkhan in the main deck, so, and Temple off the top very nicely for him here, but he's going a little bit further into red than he did in the Invitational build of this list.
And this to me seems like, people, when I've talked to you about the Green Devotion deck, Thoughtseize just seems great against this style strategy. And this game to me seems like it shows why.
Well, the deck is a lot of setup and then some action cards. Reid's list is a little bit less extreme than most of these builds are in this respect, but it's still, he has Mana Acceleration trying to bridge the gap into big threats, and Thoughtseize can be good at breaking up either end of that.
A turn 2 Temple from Dylan means that Reid gets a Xenagos into play. Looks like he's just going to make a Satyr and swing it, so Dylan is down to 17. Dylan actually, not only does he play Thoughtseize, but he has 2 Despise in his deck, a card which I believe is just a Thoughtseize against Reid's deck.
It's pretty close. Yeah, I mean, he has no spells, so he has some in his sideboard, but
Yeah, Despise can take Planeswalkers, so we'll see what it does. Dylan, though, a bit on the back foot here. He's going to read the bones on turn 3. Looks like he doesn't have the right removal spells. Despite having answers to everything, his mana curve is pretty high here.
yeah, no, he's playing a lot of 3s and 4s. His deck is definitely top heavy, and that's maybe where something like Hydra has to be the victim of the cuts if you really want Silence the Believers.
Dylan with a full 4 copies of Read the Bones, looking for that Underworld Connections style card, which we really don't have.
It's definitely not at the power level of Underworld Connections,
Right.
that's for sure.
Back to Reid. Dylan is at 15. We can put him at least to 11 just with that Xenagos. I think Reid has to balance how many more things he wants to commit to this board.
He does have to be worried about, you know, the
Sweeper, I suppose, on 5.
the end hostilities, for example. But as long as he keeps his, his portfolio diverse here, as long as he's attacking with Planeswalkers and generating creatures, then it's hard for him to get caught up in exactly one sweeper, especially with, Dylan's only on 3 mana here. So Reid can develop his board, and as long as he's coming from different angles of attack, he's probably safe from any sweeper that Dylan can put together.
Yeah, and Dylan's third land, just to note, was that Radiant Fountain you're talking about, so it offset the life loss from Read the Bones. And I do like that inclusion, especially alongside cards like Urborg, Tomb of Yawgmoth, to really fight the fact that you're playing colorless lands. Dylan likes enough to be playing a full 4 fountains.
It was not a Radiant Fountain metagame beforehand, in part because of color restrictions, in part because there was already some really attractive colorless lands like Mutavault, and you can only have so much of this stuff going on. But I think now you're going to see a lot of this card in decks.
Yeah, there's no longer things like Night Veil Spectre that you just have to cast and you have to have all your lands making colored mana for.
No Boros Reckoners, these threat cards that really put a high premium on colorless lands.
Banishing Light will take care of the World Eater here. And more life gain, a Scoured Barrens for Dylan, up to 11. He is taking a lot of damage off the Xenagos, though. He's going to have to sweep these Satyrs next turn.
Not a good sign there that Dylan had to Banishing Light the Polukranos in lieu of the Xenagos, because I don't think he has any sweeper at 5 that can clean up a Planeswalker and the creatures that are already in play. I suppose he has the hypothetical sequence of Banishing Light your Xenagos and then Bile Blight your Satyr tokens away. But that's asking a lot at this stage.
Well, I think if he Banishing Lights the Xenagos, he is lethaled on the board.
That's exactly the issue.
Yeah. Reid can just pay the monstrosity cost on Polukranos, pump it, not fight anything, but then deal 11. Reid with 3 mana is going to go for Courser of Krufix. It shows a mountain off the top, so Reid will play that. Another mountain, too much of a good thing. 3rd free Satyr, and a swing of 7 will put Dylan Fay down to 4.
And Reid still with leftovers in hand. It's not even like he's all in on this.
Yeah, Xenagos has done a lot of work in that department. All right. And even if Dylan has an end hostilities here, it's going to be problematic, right? Xenagos will make another 2/2.
Well, at that point, Dylan can follow up with a lot of powerful stuff. Another sweeper, potentially, an Elspeth, but this is the starting point.
Yep, end hostilities is cast. It's probably the second best thing he could have. I think Bile Blight plus something else would have probably been his preferred card there, but end hostilities empties the board except for the Xenagos, but Dylan is at 4.
We'll see what Reid's follow-up is. We know he's still sitting on that Reclamation stage.
He'll cast it. Satyr swings in. Reclamation Sage takes care of the Banishing Light and puts Polukranos back on the battlefield.
And now Dylan's back in the same spot that he was in before, where End Hostilities isn't a game winner, nor is killing the Xenagos.
Yeah, because of the Reclamation Sage, Elspeth wasn't a winner there either. Reid would have 4 attackers, and Dylan will scoop the cards for game 3.
And this is the issue with trying to play a 1-for-1 removal spell deck. When you're on the draw facing mana acceleration, you're going to be off pace, and the format doesn't have a lot of Doom Blades and ultimate prices anymore. The removal that's reliable is starting a lot more on the third turn, and it's very easy to just get buried with the types of starts that you saw Reid have there.
When you think about the kind of removal spells you have access to, you have Silence the Believers, Banishing Light, Hero's Downfall, Utter End if you choose to have it. These are great removal spells, all of them, but they are 3 and 4 mana spells, which seems slow even against a Devotion deck where I think you'd have the time to play them normally.
Well, in some games he's going to, in some games he's not. When you see him open up on the discard, there's a good shot that he's going to be able to buy enough time. And if Reid doesn't find red mana there very, very soon, it's possible he does have enough time. Reid was able to find red mana, and that unleashes Xenagos, which is ultimately what killed Dylan. But in the absence of the discard, if Reid's just able to do his draw uncontested, I think it is going to be tough for Dylan to keep up with the removal spells.
Yeah. I was just going to say, I was thinking about these black control decks, and the mana curve does seem really high. Reid the Bones is a great card, but it's taking Dylan's whole turn every time he casts it.
And given the mana base, he can't really play Sign in Blood. He's got a lot of lands that come into play tapped, 2 planes, 4 Radiant Fountains. So Reid the Bones probably has to be the card if for no other reason than mana base concerns. And that's another 3 mana play. I'm sure Dylan would like to be doing something on turn 2, but I don't think his mana really allows him to do that.
Had a lot of pro players here. Saw in the background just a minute ago, Miguel Gatica here. He's the captain of the Costa Rican national team for this year's World Magic Cup. He is in attendance also, I believe on his way to the Pro Tour.
Yeah, I think that we're going to have a lot of unexpected faces in the room today as we're sort of hitting the point where people are coming over to travel for the event.
As you said, this is the biggest tournament in Standard before the Pro Tour.
And it's going to make coverage so exciting. We're going to, I think, besides seeing all the new cons cards, and we have a lot to talk about as far as that goes, there's also a lot of cards from Theros block that may become players in the format now, because either maybe the format's slowed down, maybe the overall power level of the format's lower, maybe the absence of Sphinx's Revelation just means that a larger percentage of the card pool can come out and play. Right. So I'm interested to see, this could be the first tournament, for example, where some of the M15 souls show up in decks. In the format where it's defined by Sphinx's Revelation and Rabble Red, you can't play cards like souls, but if we see a lot of decks like Dylan's or even like Reid's, those cards could be a real player.
Yeah, the way I like to think about it is, you want to know what the next Desecration Demon is. If you remember, that guy went a year without seeing any play, then the format rotated and suddenly he was everywhere.
I think Jeff Hoagland's black splash green deck at the Invitational was the first time we really saw it in action.
Exactly.
But besides that, we didn't see it in block. Basically didn't show up in block.
Nope, there's too much Revelation to play that card.
But then it became a defining part of Standard.
Right, not to mention, I suppose, Pack Rat really went a year without seeing play either.
Well, Nick Spagnolo at one Invitational I know is playing a Pack Rat Loam deck, but that doesn't really count for what we're discussing here. That was Legacy.
Dylan Fay starts on a Temple, Reid on a Rugged Highlands, which is the life gain lands. We don't actually have a name for those yet, I suppose. The life gain lands. Anyway, turn 2, Dylan's gonna Thoughtseize, see what he's up against. Reid adds an Elvish Mystic, a Caryatid, a Voyaging Satyr, plenty of ramp. Lands numbers 2 and 3, his business spells, a Xenagos, and a Genesis Hydra.
Again, this is indicative of the issue that Devotion decks have with Thoughtseize and now Despise going forward. This hand is really susceptible to discard. If Dylan can get the Xenagos out of there, really only Genesis Hydra and the top of Reid's deck are the only things that are really going on.
Life gain land for Dylan, that's a Scoured Barrens. Able to I like how he has these Scoured Barrens and Radiant Fountains to really offset his Thoughtseizes and Reid the Bones.
It's a nice little synergy there, and I'm not sure if these lands are in part to try to fight Rabble Red decks and other monocolor aggressive decks, but it is pretty sweet to have them.
So one of the questions I've heard a lot of people ask is, can you play these wedge decks out of cons when Goblin Rabblemaster is a card? You want to, because there's a lot of really big rewards for playing 3 colors out of cons.
Well, you had to be shoring up your early game. That's what it comes down to. if you can get to the point where you're casting your Siege Rhinos and not too much damage is done, you're going to overpower decks like Rabble Red, but getting there is going to be the tough part.
Thoughtseize number 2 from Dylan Fay, and that's exactly what you mentioned. Genesis Hydra's taken. Reid left with 2 lands, 2 mana accelerants. I'm just going to have to now draw into his threats. I think he has done so for this turn.
Well, part of the problem is a lot of his threats aren't really draws in this respect. I mean, Polukranos or Arbor Colossus, these are threats that are pretty easy for Dylan to handle. So that's going to be an issue here. Reid really wants to find a Planeswalker or a Genesis Hydra, something that generates value in the face of removal spells.
Reid's going to fetch with the Wooded Foothills here. I believe he has a Polukranos for the turn.
Which is something, but it's very likely Dylan can handle it.
And there you go, Polukranos World Eater. I keep expecting the black decks to just end step have something like Doomblade for it. When you look at the 2 mana removal that Dylan has, it's Bioblight and Last Breath. He actually doesn't. There isn't, you know, an ultimate price or anything like that.
I think this is, I mean, we have a lot to talk about this weekend, but I think this direction is good from an R&D standpoint. Having the 2 mana removal spells not catch very much, and the 3 mana removal spells catch a lot of stuff, or hypothetically everything, means that there's the threat answer dichotomy can be really robust.
It's interesting. So a few, you know, some number of years ago, we saw that happen to counter spells. 2 mana counter spells are situational, 3 mana counter spells are cancels. And removal, it looks like, is now following the same path.
It didn't last year, but during Innistrad Standard it did, and I thought that was a big part of why that metagame was so healthy. Reid there taking a huge risk, emptying out his whole board in the face of a possible and hostilities, but looks like Dylan doesn't have it, just another Thoughtseize.
Huge Thoughtseize, took a Hornet Queen out of Reid's hand, but off the top, he's going to draw Sarkhan, the Dragon Master. This guy, if you haven't gotten to see him yet, he is competing with Stormbreath Dragon, and he's quite a beating. So his plus ability basically turns him into a Stormbreath Dragon. He gets 4/4 flying, haste, indestructible on top of that. And he also can kill some creatures with his minus ability and give you an emblem at 6.
And the emblem's a real thing. I think people are losing sight of that fact. That's a real power.
Yeah, you draw. You have to discard your hand at the end of every turn, but you'll draw 3 a turn with that emblem.
That Sarkhan could not have come at a better time for Reid.
Dylan, without a main phase answer to Sarkhan, passes to Reid. You wonder if Silence the Believers or some Hero's Downfall style card is in Dylan's hand.
Well, Hero's Downfall he doesn't have to really worry about because Sarkhan gets indestructible.
Right.
Silence the Believers is a concern, but Dylan didn't have it last turn where I believe he would have had the opportunity to do so. And in any event, Dylan doesn't have enough mana to strive it. So even if he does have it, it's not the worst thing.
Right.
The other question is, what are you going to do on this turn besides? Not animate and just sit there? You got to do something.
Have to do something. Sarkhan ticks up to 6. It's going to swing for 4. Reid with no other attacks here. Looks like it's going to be, is that Genesis Hydra? And it is.
Pretty good.
Wow.
Pretty good
For
running
5.
set of draws.
Yeah. Genesis Hydra into looks like
Sure.
Nissa Worldwaker. And this is a game I thought Dylan had this one.
Me too.
And 2 draws later, he has made a Sarkhan, a Nissa, and a 5/5 Genesis Hydra.
Now keep in mind, there is the one Fated Retribution in Dylan's sideboard, so.
Looking at the exact same thing, I was trying to think what kind of card can save Dylan here. It would have to come with an untapped white mana as well.
It's asking a lot, but Dylan does have a way in his 75 to get out of this. But I agree with you. This game was shaping up really well for Dylan, and Reid on back-to-back turns with just 2 insane draws.
They may have been his best possible draws. I'm
Yeah,
trying to think of things that are better.
Maybe you'd want it in the other order, but we're splitting hairs here.
Yeah. And he had the Hornet Queen on the turn before. Dylan did have the Thoughtseize for that one, but Reid will animate that Nykthos. Can Dylan Fated Retribution? He cannot, and that will be the match for Reid Duke. I want to say he had the Retribution, but did not have the untapped white. It looked like that there.
You couldn't tell from the looks of things there, but in any case, Reid Duke with a hard-fought win to start off the tournament, but a good start for his Green Devotion deck, a deck that he liked pre-rotation and clearly still likes now.